The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Harmony Community Center, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. The faint melody of a beginner's piano lesson drifted from one of the practice rooms, notes stumbling and recovering like a child learning to walk. Violet Hayes sat at the grand piano in the main hall, her fingers moving effortlessly across the keys. She played from memory, a piece by Debussy that always calmed her restless thoughts. Her chestnut brown hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple cream sweater with faded jeans. This was her sanctuary, the place where music spoke louder than words ever could. "Violet, you have mail," called Mrs. Patterson, the center's receptionist, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. Violet's hands paused mid-phrase. She glanced over her shoulder to see Mrs. Patterson approaching with a cream-colored envelope, its edges gilded in rose gold. Even from a distance, Violet recognized the expensive stationery. Her stomach dropped. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the envelope with fingers that suddenly felt cold. Mrs. Patterson lingered for a moment, her eyes filled with the kind of sympathy that made everything worse. "Are you all right, dear?" "I'm fine," Violet lied, forcing a smile that felt like glass on her face. When she was alone again, Violet stared at the envelope. Her name was written in elegant calligraphy across the front. Miss Violet Hayes. No return address needed. She knew exactly who it was from. She slid her thumb beneath the seal and pulled out the invitation. Heavy cardstock unfolded in her hands, revealing words that made her breath catch. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Bradley Michael Pierce and Natalie Rose Morgan. Saturday, November 18th. The date blurred before her eyes. 6 months. It had been 6 months since Bradley had stood in her apartment, unable to meet her gaze, and told her he couldn't go through with their wedding. 6 months since Natalie, her roommate and supposed best friend, had moved out without explanation. 6 months since Violet had discovered the truth in a single photograph posted carelessly online. Bradley and Natalie together at a ski resort, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, both of them smiling like they hadn't just shattered someone's entire world. Violet carefully placed the invitation on the piano bench and walked to the window. Outside, autumn leaves tumbled across the parking lot. Couples strolled past, hands intertwined, completely unaware of the woman watching them from behind glass, trying to remember what that kind of careless happiness felt like. She should throw the invitation away. She should ignore it entirely. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Violet knew she wouldn't. Something stubborn and proud inside her refused to hide. She would go. She would walk into that wedding with her head held high, proving to Bradley, to Natalie, and mostly to herself, that she had survived. Later that evening, Violet stood in the lobby of the Grandmont Hotel, adjusting the strap of her simple black dress. The charity concert had been her director's idea, a way to support the arts foundation that kept their community center funded. She hadn't wanted to come, but duty had a way of overriding personal comfort. The lobby buzzed with elegantly dressed guests. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Violet accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, gripping it perhaps too tightly. She was trying to navigate toward a quieter corner when someone bumped her arm. The champagne sloshed dangerously, then spilled forward, splashing across an expensive charcoal suit jacket. "Oh, no!" Violet gasped, mortification flooding through her. "I am so sorry." The man stepped back, looking down at his now stained jacket with an expression that was more curious than angry. When he lifted his gaze to meet hers, Violet found herself staring into the most striking gray eyes she had ever seen. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair styled with casual precision. His features were sharp, but not harsh, and there was an air of quiet confidence about him that made the crowded lobby seem to fade into the background. "It's only champagne," he said, his voice low and calm. "I've survived worse." "Still, I should help," Violet insisted, setting down her glass and reaching for the cloth napkin from a nearby table. She dabbed uselessly at his jacket, acutely aware of how close she was standing to him, how expensive his cologne smelled. How utterly mortified she felt. "Really, it's fine," he said, gently catching her wrist to stop her frantic cleaning. His touch was warm, steady. "I'm Ethan Cross." "Violet Hayes," she replied automatically, pulling her hand back. "And I'm usually not this clumsy. Today has just been terrible." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of genuine interest. "Terrible how?" Violet hesitated. She didn't know this man. She had no reason to burden him with her problems. But maybe that was exactly why the words came spilling out. "I got a wedding invitation today," she said quietly. "From my ex-fiancé. He's marrying the woman he left me for. And I'm going because apparently I enjoy emotional torture." Ethan studied her for a long moment. "You're going alone?" "I don't really have a choice," Violet admitted, then let out a short, bitter laugh. "Unless I can convince a complete stranger to pretend to be my date for one day." The words hung in the air between them. Violet immediately regretted them. What was she thinking? This man, this sophisticated stranger in his expensive ruined suit, had no reason to help her. She had just made herself look desperate and foolish. But Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't make excuses or retreat. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, considering her with those penetrating gray eyes. "One day?" he asked. Violet blinked. "What? You said one day? Just the wedding?" Her heart began to pound. "I wasn't serious. I mean, you don't even know me." "No," Ethan agreed. "But I know what it's like to want to face something difficult without feeling alone." He paused, then extended his hand. "I'll do it one day." "Your fake date." Violet stared at his hand as if it were a lifeline thrown across dark water. This was insane. This was reckless. This was exactly the kind of impulsive decision she never made. She reached out and shook his hand. "Deal," she whispered, and just like that, everything changed. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear skies and crisp November air. Violet stood before her bedroom mirror, smoothing down the elegant navy dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was sophisticated without being flashy, fitted but modest, the kind of dress that whispered confidence rather than shouting for attention. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Ready when you are." No pressure, she smiled despite her nerves. Over the past week, they had met twice for coffee, ostensibly to coordinate their story, but really just to get to know each other. She had learned that Ethan was an entrepreneur who had built his wealth through strategic tech investments, that he preferred quiet evenings to loud parties, and that he had a surprising knowledge of classical music. He had listened to her stories about teaching piano to underprivileged children, about the students who struggled and the ones who soared, and he had seemed genuinely interested. Now, as his sleek black car pulled up outside her building, Violet took a deep breath and headed downstairs. Ethan stood beside the car, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt. When he saw her, something flickered in his expression, appreciation mixed with something softer. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "You clean up well yourself," Violet replied, grateful her voice didn't shake. "Ready for this?" "The question is, are you ready?" Violet considered lying, but something about Ethan made her want to be honest. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The drive to Rosewood Estate took 40 minutes. They spent it reviewing their fabricated story. They had met at the charity concert, had been seeing each other casually for a few weeks. Nothing too serious. "Keep it vague," Ethan had advised. "Less to remember, harder to disprove." When they arrived, the venue took Violet's breath away. The estate sprawled across manicured grounds with a stone mansion at its center and gardens that seemed to stretch forever. White tents billowed in the breeze. Guests in designer clothes clustered in groups laughing and sipping cocktails. Ethan came around to open her door, offering his hand. "We can leave any time you want," he murmured. "Just say the word." Violet nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They walked together up the stone pathway, Ethan's hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Violet felt eyes turning toward them immediately. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Inside the mansion's grand entrance hall, a table held the guest book. Violet signed her name with steady hands, then Ethan added his signature beside hers. The simple act felt strangely intimate. Violet. The voice came from behind them, sharp with surprise. Violet turned slowly to find Natalie standing there, resplendent in a champagne-colored bridesmaid dress. Her blonde hair was styled in elaborate curls, her makeup flawless, but her eyes were wide with shock. "Natalie," Violet replied evenly. "Congratulations." Natalie's gaze slid to Ethan, confusion and something else, perhaps unease, crossing her features. "I didn't know you were bringing someone." "This is Ethan Cross," Violet said. "Ethan, this is Natalie Morgan, the bride." Ethan extended his hand with smooth courtesy. "Congratulations on your wedding." Natalie shook his hand mechanically, still staring. "How do you two know each other?" "We met recently," Ethan said, his tone pleasant but revealing nothing. "Violet spilled champagne on me, actually. Best accident that ever happened." Despite everything, Violet felt a small smile tug at her lips. Before Natalie could respond, another voice cut through the moment. "Violet, you came." Bradley Pierce stood at the top of the curved staircase looking down at them. He wore a classic black tuxedo, his sandy hair perfectly styled, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Violet was transported back to the night he proposed, to all the promises he had made under starlight. Then she remembered how easily he had broken them. "Of course I came," Violet said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You invited me." Bradley descended the stairs, his eyes never leaving her face. But when he reached the bottom step, his gaze finally shifted to Ethan, and something changed in his expression. Calculation, assessment, male territorial instinct. "And you are?" Bradley asked, his tone just barely polite. "Ethan Cross," Ethan replied, not offering his hand this time. "Interesting," Bradley said slowly. "I don't believe Violet mentioned she was seeing anyone." "We're keeping things low-key," Ethan said smoothly. The ceremony took place in the garden under an arch of white roses and ivy. Violet and Ethan sat toward the middle, not in the front where Bradley's family sat, but not hidden in the back either. As the processional music began, Violet felt Ethan's hand find hers, his fingers interweaving with hers in silent support. She watched Bradley stand at the altar, watched the way his eyes kept drifting to where she sat. She saw the moment Natalie appeared at the end of the aisle, beautiful and radiant, and felt nothing but a distant ache, like pressing on a bruise that was finally starting to heal. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the silence stretched unbearably. Violet held her breath, but the moment passed, and Bradley and Natalie were pronounced husband and wife. The reception was held in an enormous white tent strung with thousands of fairy lights. Round tables draped in ivory linen surrounded a polished dance floor. At the center of it all, the bride and groom's table gleamed with crystal and silver. Violet and Ethan were seated at table 12, far enough from the center to be forgettable. Their table mates were distant cousins of the groom, pleasant people who asked polite questions and accepted vague answers. Dinner service began with champagne toasts. Bradley's best man delivered a speech full of inside jokes and veiled references that made Violet's stomach turn. Then Natalie's sister spoke, her words saccharine and hollow. As dessert was being served, Bradley himself stood, glass in hand. The tent fell silent. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Bradley began, his voice carrying easily across the space. "Marriage is about finding the person who completes you, who makes you better than you were before." His eyes found Violet across the crowded tent. The look was pointed, deliberate. "It's about knowing when something isn't right," Bradley continued, "and having the courage to pursue what is." Violet felt her face flush with humiliation. Beside her, Ethan went very still. "Some people live in the past," Bradley went on, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But I prefer to look forward, to the future Natalie and I are building together." The implication was clear. Violet was the past, the mistake, the thing he had been brave enough to leave behind. Applause rippled through the tent, but it felt thin, uncomfortable. Several guests glanced toward Violet with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity. Ethan set down his fork with deliberate care. Then he stood. The movement drew attention immediately. He was tall enough, commanding enough that people noticed. The applause faded into confused silence. "If I may," Ethan said, his voice calm but carrying an edge Violet had never heard before. "Since we're sharing toasts about honesty and courage." Bradley's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure this is the appropriate moment." "Oh, I think it is," Ethan replied. He turned to address the tent at large. "I'm Ethan Cross. I'm here with Violet Hayes, who many of you may know was engaged to the groom about a year ago." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Natalie half stood from her seat, her face draining of color. "What are you doing?" Bradley demanded, his composure cracking. "Telling the truth," Ethan said simply. "You spoke about courage, Bradley. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the courage it takes to call off a wedding 3 weeks before the date. Or the courage it takes to start a relationship with your fiancé's best friend while you're still engaged." The tent erupted in whispers. Violet sat frozen, unable to process what was happening. "That's not true," Bradley said, but his voice wavered. "It is true," Ethan continued, his tone never rising but somehow growing more forceful. "I've seen the credit card receipts for the hotel rooms. The text messages. The timeline doesn't lie, Bradley. You were with Natalie for months before you ended things with Violet." "How dare you?" Natalie choked out, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "This is my wedding." Ethan finally looked at Violet, his expression softening. "Violet didn't know. She believed you when you said it just wasn't working. She blamed herself, and you let her." The weight of every eye in the tent pressed down on Violet. Her hands trembled in her lap. Part of her wanted to run, to disappear, to pretend this wasn't happening. But another part, a stronger part, stood up on shaking legs. "Is it true?" she asked Bradley, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying in the shocked silence. "All of it?" Bradley's face had gone red. "Violet, this isn't the time or place." "Answer her," Ethan said quietly. For a long moment, Bradley said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and Violet saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke it aloud. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said weakly. That was all Violet needed to hear. She picked up her clutch, turned to Ethan, and said with perfect clarity, "I'd like to leave now." Ethan offered his arm without hesitation. Together, they walked through the silent tent, past tables of stunned guests, past the bride who was now sobbing openly, past the groom who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They simply left with dignity intact, leaving behind the ruins of a wedding that had been built on lies from the very beginning. The car ride back was silent for the first 10 minutes. Violet stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Finally, she spoke. "How did you know? About Bradley and Natalie?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "After you told me about the wedding, I did some research. It's a habit of mine, knowing who I'm dealing with. I found some inconsistencies in their story, dug a little deeper. I'm sorry I didn't tell you before, but I wasn't sure until yesterday when I confirmed the timeline with a private investigator." "You hired a private investigator?" Violet's voice was hollow, emotionless. "I did. Because something about your story didn't sit right with me. You deserved to know the truth." Violet was quiet for another moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a broken sound, caught between relief and grief. "All this time I thought it was my fault. That I wasn't enough. That I'd done something wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," Ethan said firmly. "They did." The tears came then, silent and steady, streaming down Violet's face. Ethan pulled the car over to the side of the road into a quiet overlook above the valley. He turned off the engine and waited. "I'm sorry," Violet managed through her tears. "I ruined your suit twice now, and I dragged you into that disaster, and you barely even know me." "Violet, look at me." She turned to face him, wiping ineffectively at her cheeks. "You didn't drag me anywhere," Ethan said. "I chose to be there. And I'd choose it again." Something in his voice made her breath catch. "Why?" Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Because from the moment you spilled champagne on me and looked at me with those honest eyes, I knew you were someone worth knowing. Someone worth protecting. You don't have to say that, Violet whispered. I know I don't have to. I want to. They sat there in the fading afternoon light, the city spread out below them like a carpet of lights beginning to twinkle on. Slowly, Violet's tears subsided. She felt raw, exposed, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying had finally been lifted. What happens now? She asked quietly. Ethan smiled slightly. Now you go home, take a long bath, drink some tea, and remember that you survived. Tomorrow you wake up and keep surviving. And eventually, surviving turns into living. Sounds like you speak from experience. Maybe I do. The next few days were difficult. News of the wedding catastrophe spread through social circles like wildfire. Violet's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some supportive, some merely curious, some outright cruel. She turned it off after the second day and focused on her students, losing herself in scales and sonatas. Ethan checked in daily with simple text messages. Thinking of you. Hope you're taking care of yourself. Here, if you need anything. He never pushed, never demanded her time or attention. He simply made his presence known, steady and reliable as sunrise. 2 weeks after the wedding, Violet finally agreed to meet him for dinner. They chose a small Italian restaurant far from the fashionable districts, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. How are you, really? Ethan asked after they'd ordered. Violet considered the question carefully. I'm okay. Actually, okay, not just saying it. I realized something these past few weeks. Bradley leaving was the best thing that could have happened to me. I would have married someone who didn't truly love me, who was capable of such betrayal. Now I'm free. You are, Ethan agreed. And for what it's worth, he's a fool. They talked through dinner about everything and nothing. Violet shared stories about her most challenging students. Ethan described his latest investment project, a sustainable housing development for low-income families. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, without the pressure of their fake arrangement or the drama of the wedding. As they walked to his car afterward, Violet said suddenly, "Our deal is done. You fulfilled your end. One day, just like I asked." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "Is that what you want? For this to be over?" Violet met his gaze. In the streetlight, his gray eyes looked silver. "What do you want?" "I want to take you to dinner again," Ethan said simply. "And not as a fake date, as a real one. I want to know what makes you laugh, what music you play when you're alone, how you take your coffee in the morning. I want to be someone you choose, not someone you need for show." Violet's heart hammered in her chest. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," Ethan said softly, "but it did." She thought about Bradley, about how he had chosen her for the wrong reasons and left her for worse ones. She thought about trust, about risk, about the courage it takes to try again after being hurt. And then she thought about Ethan, about his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, the way he had stood up for her when no one else had. "Coffee," she said finally. "I take my coffee with cream and 1 sugar. And I play Chopin when I'm alone because it feels like having a conversation with someone who understands melancholy." Ethan smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Good to know. What else? I guess you'll have to keep taking me to dinner to find out." "I can work with that." 6 months passed like pages turning in a favorite book. Violet and Ethan built something together, slowly and carefully. They had real dates at quiet restaurants and loud concerts. They took long walks through the city and longer conversations over wine. Ethan came to her student recitals, sitting in the back row and applauding louder than anyone when her kids performed. Violet visited his construction sites, wearing a hard hat and asking questions that made his contractors smile. They learned each other's rhythms and routines, their scars and their hopes. There were no grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, there were Tuesday mornings when Ethan showed up at her door with coffee made exactly right, and Friday evenings when Violet played piano while he worked on his laptop nearby, content just to be in the same space. It was real. It was steady. It was everything Violet had thought she wanted with Bradley but actually found with Ethan. On a warm spring evening, Ethan asked Violet to meet him at Harmony Community Center after her last lesson. She arrived to find the main hall dark except for candles lining the walkway to the grand piano. "Ethan?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly. He stepped out from behind the piano wearing jeans and a simple sweater, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "Remember when we made our deal?" he asked. "One day, one fake date, nothing more?" "I remember," Violet said, walking slowly toward him. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," Ethan continued. "About how one day changed everything. How agreeing to pretend led to something real." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Violet's breath caught. "I'm not good at speeches," Ethan said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I'm better with numbers and contracts and things that make logical sense. But you don't make logical sense, Violet. Loving you doesn't fit into any spreadsheet or business plan." Tears were already forming in Violet's eyes. "What I'm trying to say, very badly, is that I don't want to pretend anymore," Ethan said. "I want real. I want forever. I want coffee with cream and 1 sugar every morning, and Chopin in the evenings and all the days in between." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a single diamond that caught the candlelight. "Violet Hayes, will you marry me? For real this time." Violet laughed through her tears, the sound echoing off the high ceiling of the hall where she had received Bradley's wedding invitation all those months ago. How strange life was, how unexpected its turns. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, Ethan, I'll marry you. For real." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, holding him tight, feeling his heart beat against hers. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "For what?" "For being my fake date. For becoming my real everything." Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside Harmony Community Center, beside the piano where Violet had first held Bradley's invitation with shaking hands, 2 people who had started with pretense found something genuine. One day had indeed changed everything. But it was all the days after, the ones they chose together, that truly mattered. And as Ethan kissed her beneath the warm glow of candlelight, Violet understood that sometimes the best love stories don't begin with certainty. Sometimes they begin with a champagne stain, a desperate request, and the courage to try something unexpected. Sometimes they begin with just one day.